The fastest way to make someone call the police is to calmly exercise a right they never knew you had. The old steel valve groaned beneath my hand with the same deep metallic sound I had heard since I was a boy. I gave it one steady turn clockwise, felt the resistance ease, and listened as the steady rush of water inside the underground main slowly faded into silence. The quiet that followed lasted less than 3 minutes. Then came the sirens. They echoed across the open fields of my ranch, bouncing off weathered barns and rolling over the pastures until red and blue lights appeared in a cloud of dust racing down my private gravel road. I stood beside the valve box with a pipe wrench still resting against my boot, wondering how routine maintenance had somehow become a police emergency. The lead patrol vehicle stopped 20 feet away. 2 deputies stepped out calmly, hands resting comfortably near their belts, scanning the area before looking directly at me. Behind them, a white luxury sport utility vehicle came to an abrupt stop. Patricia Whitmore climbed out before her engine had even gone quiet. She pointed straight at me with dramatic certainty, as though she had just caught someone committing a serious crime in broad daylight. "That is him," she shouted. "He shut off the neighborhood's water. Arrest him before he turns it back on." One of the deputies glanced from Patricia to me, then toward the valve sitting inside the open utility box. "Sir," he asked in an even voice, "did you close this valve?" "Yes," I answered. "About 3 minutes ago." Patricia threw both hands into the air. "See?" He admitted it. The deputy nodded without changing his expression. "May I ask why?" I looked toward the trench running across a section of my pasture where fresh soil surrounded an exposed section of aging water pipe. "Because I am replacing 40 feet of deteriorated line before it fails completely," I replied. "You cannot replace a pressurized main while water is still flowing through it." The deputy looked from the trench back to Patricia. She immediately stepped closer. "That explanation does not matter. Hundreds of homes depend on that water. He cannot just decide to shut it off whenever he feels like it." I almost smiled, not because the situation was funny, but because I had heard variations of that sentence for years. The breeze carried the familiar scent of damp earth mixed with machine oil from the small excavator parked nearby. A pair of hawks circled overhead while my diesel pump sat completely silent for the first time all morning. Everything around me felt ordinary except the growing crowd gathering near my entrance. Curious neighbors stood beside the fence whispering among themselves, phones already raised to record whatever happened next. The deputies walked over to inspect the excavation. One crouched beside the exposed pipe, studying the fresh fittings laid neatly across a clean tarp. Copper couplings, replacement gaskets, pressure gauges, and brand new sections of pipe were organized exactly the way I always prepared before beginning maintenance. Nothing about the work looked rushed or careless. It looked planned, professional, necessary. Patricia continued speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He thinks because this ranch is old he can control everyone else's utilities. This is community infrastructure now." I looked at the deputy and quietly said, "Before anybody decides who controls this valve, I think the more important question is who actually owns it." One of the deputies looked at me for a long moment before asking the question I had been expecting. "Do you have any documentation showing this equipment belongs to you?" I nodded, wiped the dust from my hands with an old shop towel, and walked toward my pickup truck parked beneath a sprawling live oak tree. Inside the cab sat a weathered leather binder that had traveled with me for years. Most people kept registration papers in their glove compartment. I kept nearly 80 years of family history inside that binder, because ranch life teaches you one simple lesson. Land remembers everything, but paperwork proves it. My name is Malcolm Carter. I am a civil infrastructure engineer by profession, but long before I ever earned that title, I learned how water moved through this ranch from my grandfather. He believed every valve had a purpose, and every pipe told a story if you listened carefully enough. When I was 8 years old, he would wake me before sunrise, hand me a flashlight, and take me out to inspect the pump house while dew still covered the grass. He never rushed those mornings. He showed me where every underground line branched away from the main supply, explained why pressure had to be reduced before replacing worn sections, and taught me that clean water was something people should respect instead of taking for granted. My father continued those lessons after my grandfather passed away. Every major valve on the ranch carried a small set of hand-stamped initials carved into the steel housing so future generations would know exactly when each section had been installed. Even now, kneeling beside the open valve box, I could still see those faded marks beneath years of weather and mineral stains. I ran my fingers across the cold metal for just a second before opening the binder. Inside were original deeds, water rights documentation, maintenance logs dating back decades, engineering drawings, inspection reports, and carefully updated maps showing every inch of the private water system that crossed our property. Nothing in those pages had been created overnight. Every record represented years of responsibility. While I organized the documents on the tailgate of my truck, Patricia continued speaking loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. She insisted the neighborhood had relied on that water system for years, which was true, but she conveniently left out a detail that mattered far more. Depending on something does not automatically create ownership. Plenty of neighbors bought produce from local farms every weekend, but that did not make the farm's community property. One deputy quietly studied the maintenance logs while the other walked around the excavation site. He examined the replacement pipe, the shutoff assembly, the warning cones, and the neatly stacked fittings waiting to be installed. Finally, he looked back toward me. "This does not look like emergency work," he observed. "No, sir," I answered. "It is scheduled maintenance. I shut the water off today because I found corrosion during last week's inspection, and I would rather replace 40 feet of pipe now than repair 400 feet after a rupture." The deputy nodded thoughtfully, but before he could ask another question, Patricia stepped forward again with absolute confidence. "He can call it maintenance all day long," she declared. "That water belongs to our community now." I closed the binder, rested one hand on its worn leather cover, and realized that everything about to happen would depend on whether anyone was willing to separate years of assumptions from a single documented fact. The deputy carefully closed the binder and handed it back to me without saying a word. He was not interested in opinions anymore. He was looking for facts, and that small change in the conversation was impossible to miss. Patricia noticed it too. Her confident smile faded for just a moment before she stepped closer to the deputies again. "You cannot seriously be considering his paperwork over the needs of hundreds of homeowners," she insisted. "Our association has managed this water system for years." The deputy remained calm. "Managed is not the same as owned," he replied. Those 6 words hung in the warm morning air like a gate slowly swinging open. I had heard Patricia make that same claim so many times that I almost knew exactly what she would say next. Looking back, I realized this argument had not started that morning beside an open valve box. It had been building for nearly 3 years. The first time Patricia visited my ranch, she complimented the land before asking questions that seemed harmless. She wanted to know how often the pumps ran, who maintained the underground lines, and whether expanding the neighborhood would require improvements to the water system. I answered politely because none of those questions seemed unusual. As the president of the homeowners association, she said she simply wanted to understand the area's infrastructure. Months later, she returned with engineers hired by the association. They asked if they could walk part of the property to better understand where utility corridors crossed the ranch. I agreed, believing they were only gathering information. At no point did anyone ask to purchase the water system. Nobody requested an easement. Nobody presented a legal agreement granting permanent access. They simply observed, took notes, thanked me for my time, and left. After Willow Creek Estates continued expanding, I started noticing unfamiliar trucks parked near my fence line. Contractors occasionally inspected connection points where neighborhood distribution pipes branched away from the main supply, crossing my ranch. They always acted as though they belonged there. When I asked who had authorized the inspections, someone would casually mention the association. It was never presented as a question. It was presented as an assumption. Patricia became more confident with every passing year. She spoke about the water system during association meetings as though it had gradually become part of the neighborhood simply because residents depended on it. Convenience slowly transformed into expectation. Expectation slowly transformed into entitlement. Eventually, she stopped asking whether something belonged to the association and began acting as though that question had already been answered long ago. Several neighbors later admitted they genuinely believed the homeowners association owned the entire water network because Patricia spoke with such certainty whenever the subject came up. Confidence has a strange way of sounding like authority when nobody checks the records. Standing beside the open trench that morning, I finally understood what had happened. Nobody had stolen my property through force. They had attempted something far quieter. They had repeated the same assumption often enough that people stopped distinguishing between access and ownership. The deputy looked toward the steel valve again before turning back to Patricia. "Ma'am," he asked respectfully, "can you provide any deed, easement, recorded agreement, or county document showing your association owns this section of the system?" For the first time since the patrol cars arrived, Patricia did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the neighbors gathered behind the fence as though expecting someone else to speak for her. Nobody did. The deputy waited patiently, giving Patricia every opportunity to answer. She opened her mouth twice before finally reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out a neatly organized folder with the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association logo stamped across the front. She flipped through several color-coded tabs before handing over a packet of documents with an expression that suggested the matter had already been settled. The deputy spent several quiet minutes reviewing every page while the morning breeze rustled the tall grass surrounding the trench. Finally, he looked up. "These appear to be neighborhood maintenance agreements," he said. "I do not see a recorded deed, utility easement, or ownership transfer for the valve or the main line located on this property." Patricia immediately responded with complete confidence. "We have maintained portions of that system for years. That establishes our authority." I recognized the statement because I had heard variations of it during association meetings, community newsletters, and conversations with contractors. Somewhere along the way, routine maintenance had gradually become proof of ownership in Patricia's mind. The problem was that property law did not work that way. I calmly reached into my binder again and removed a laminated maintenance schedule covered with handwritten notes dating back almost 2 decades. Every inspection, every pressure test, every valve replacement, and every repair had been documented by my father before me and by me afterward. Even the work we were performing that morning had been scheduled nearly 3 weeks earlier after I detected early signs of internal corrosion during a routine pressure inspection. The replacement materials stacked beside the trench had been delivered 4 days earlier, long before anyone called the sheriff's office. Nothing about this project was sudden. Nothing had been done in secret. One deputy walked over to examine the exposed section of pipe more closely. Fresh paint marks clearly identified the cut locations. Pressure gauges remained connected exactly where they should have been before removing the damaged section. Safety cones surrounded the excavation, and replacement fittings were arranged in installation order across a clean tarp. "Everything here looks professionally prepared," he quietly observed to his partner. Patricia folded her arms. "Professional or not, he cannot interrupt water service for an entire community without our permission." That sentence caught the deputy's attention immediately. "Permission from whom?" he asked. "From the association," she answered without hesitation. The deputy looked back toward me. "Mr. Carter, did anyone request that you postpone today's maintenance?" I nodded. "Yes, several weeks ago." Patricia looked surprised that I admitted it. "And what happened?" the deputy asked. "I declined," I replied, "because no one requesting the delay had legal authority over my private infrastructure, and postponing the repair increased the likelihood of a pipe failure." I pointed toward the exposed section of aging steel pipe resting beside the trench. Rust had eaten deeply into several areas, leaving the metal noticeably thinner than surrounding sections. "If that line failed unexpectedly," I explained, "water service would have been interrupted for far longer than the few hours needed for planned maintenance." The deputy studied the damaged pipe carefully before looking toward Patricia once again. The growing crowd had become unusually quiet. Even neighbors who had arrived expecting an arrest now seemed more interested in listening than recording. Then one elderly resident slowly stepped forward from behind the fence and spoke in a hesitant voice. "I have lived here since before the subdivision was built," he said. "I always thought Mr. Carter's family owned the original water system. I just assumed the paperwork changed at some point." His words settled over the gathering like dust after a passing truck, because for the first time that morning, someone had quietly admitted that assumptions were beginning to fall apart. After nearly an hour of questions, the deputies finally reached a decision. One of them closed his notebook and looked directly at Patricia. "Based on what we have seen today, There is no evidence that Mr. Carter committed a criminal offense by performing maintenance on infrastructure located on his own property. His voice remained calm and professional, but the effect on the crowd was immediate. Several neighbors quietly lowered their phones while Patricia's expression hardened with disbelief. "So you were just going to leave?" she asked. "He shut off water to our entire neighborhood." The deputy nodded respectfully. "This appears to be a property rights and civil documentation issue, not a criminal matter. If ownership is disputed, that question belongs in the appropriate legal forum." With that, both patrol vehicles slowly pulled away, leaving behind only the sound of gravel crunching beneath their tires. Patricia remained standing beside the road for several more minutes before returning to her vehicle without another word. I expected the matter to end there. I was wrong. Over the following week, I noticed unfamiliar activity around the ranch almost every day. Survey crews appeared near the property entrance taking measurements they had never requested permission to perform. Utility contractors drove slowly along my fence line, stopping occasionally to photograph connection points leading toward the subdivision. Then certified letters from the Homeowners Association began arriving in my mailbox. Each one claimed the association possessed historical authority over portions of the neighborhood water system and requested immediate access for inspections. Curiously, none of the letters included copies of recorded easements, deeds, or legal agreements supporting those claims. They simply repeated the same assumption in different words. That was when I decided to stop responding with explanations and start responding with records. I spent 2 full days inside the county archives requesting every document connected to the original subdivision approval. Boxes of aging survey maps, planning commission minutes, engineering reports, utility filings, and land transfer records slowly accumulated across a long wooden table. The clerk helping me noticed the growing stack and smiled. "Planning to build something?" she asked. "No," I answered. "I am trying to understand something that was already built." We reviewed development files dating back more than 20 years. The original subdivision plans clearly showed neighborhood water distribution lines connecting to an existing private main crossing my family's ranch. That part surprised no one. What surprised me was everything missing from the record. I searched for recorded utility easements. None existed. I searched for purchase agreements transferring ownership of the private main. None existed. I searched for county approvals granting the Homeowners Association operational control over the infrastructure located on my land. Again, nothing. The absence of paperwork became evidence all by itself. Late that afternoon, the county records supervisor approached my table carrying one final archive box that had been stored separately because of its age. Inside rested an engineering review prepared before Willow Creek Estates was ever approved for construction. Tucked between faded utility drawings was a formal application submitted by the original developer requesting a permanent easement across my family's ranch for future water access. Across the first page, stamped in bold red letters, were 2 words that immediately caught my attention. "Request denied." I slowly turned the remaining pages and discovered the reason. My grandfather had refused to surrender ownership of the water main, but had voluntarily allowed temporary access through a revocable private agreement that expired years before Patricia ever became association president. At that moment, I realized the entire dispute had been built upon something astonishingly simple. They had spent years acting as though a permission that no longer existed had somehow become ownership. Armed with copies of every relevant record, I requested a meeting with the county engineering department instead of responding to another letter from the Homeowners Association. I knew opinions would only create more arguments, but official records reviewed by the people responsible for public infrastructure would answer questions that speculation never could. 2 days later, I sat across a conference table from a senior county engineer named Daniel Foster. Large utility maps covered one wall of the room, showing roads, drainage systems, electrical corridors, and water networks stretching across the entire county. I spread my documents across the table one by one. The original deed, the recorded water rights, decades of maintenance logs, the denied easement application, the revocable access agreement signed by my grandfather. Daniel examined each document carefully before pulling up the county's digital utility database. He zoomed into my ranch, then followed the blue line representing the neighborhood distribution system until it intersected with the private main crossing my property. After several quiet minutes, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Now I understand why everyone is confused," he said. He rotated the monitor so I could see it more clearly. "The subdivision's distribution network is public record. Your family's transmission line is not. They connect here, but they are not the same system." He pointed directly at the junction where the neighborhood pipes branched away from the original main. "The Homeowners Association has maintained portions of its own distribution network after this connection point, but according to every recorded document we have, they never owned the transmission line delivering water to it." Hearing those words from the county engineer carried far more weight than hearing them from me. Daniel continued reviewing archived approvals connected to the subdivision's construction. Every permit consistently identified my family's infrastructure as privately owned. Every engineering review referenced the neighborhood's dependence on that private connection. None transferred ownership. None granted permanent operational authority. Then he located something neither of us expected. Buried inside an old inspection report was correspondence between the county and the original developer written shortly after construction began. The letter reminded the developer that future maintenance of the private transmission line remained the responsibility of the Carter family unless a recorded transfer or easement was approved. The file contained no evidence that either event had ever occurred. Daniel slowly closed the folder. "From an engineering standpoint," he said, "the neighborhood connected into your existing system. They did not absorb it." That single sentence untangled years of misunderstanding. Before I left, he asked one final question. "During your maintenance project, did you notify residents that service would be temporarily interrupted?" I nodded and showed him copies of notices I had mailed, electronic messages sent through the neighborhood bulletin board, and photographs of warning signs posted at each subdivision entrance 72 hours before the scheduled shutdown. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "So they were informed in advance?" "Yes," I answered. "Multiple times." He smiled politely. "Then this was never a surprise interruption. It was scheduled maintenance on privately owned infrastructure that happened to supply another system." Walking back to my truck with a certified copy of the county findings in my hands, I realized something important. Patricia had not created the facts. She had simply spent years speaking louder than the documents. Now the documents had finally found their own voice. The county engineering findings spread through Willow Creek Estates much faster than I expected. By the end of the week, neighbors who had watched the deputies arrive at my ranch were now reading copies of the same documents that explained exactly how the water system had been built decades earlier. The conversations began changing almost overnight. Instead of asking why I had shut the water off, people started asking a very different question. How had everyone believed the association owned infrastructure that county records consistently identified as private property? Patricia tried to regain control of the narrative by calling a special homeowners association meeting. According to the notice distributed throughout the subdivision, the purpose was to discuss protecting community utilities. I attended quietly with my binder resting on the empty chair beside me. I had no interest in making speeches. The records could speak for themselves. The clubhouse filled quickly. Homeowners who had never attended a meeting before took seats along the walls, carrying printed copies of county correspondence and engineering maps. Patricia opened the meeting with her usual confidence, insisting that the association had always acted in the community's best interest. No one openly disagreed, but the room felt different. People were listening with more caution than trust. About 20 minutes into the discussion, one homeowner stood and held up the certified engineering findings. "Can someone explain why these documents say the main transmission line has always belonged to the Carter family?" he asked. Another resident followed with a second question. "If the association never owned it, why were we repeatedly told it did?" Patricia responded that the association had managed the situation based on long-standing community understanding. That explanation might have worked a month earlier, but not anymore. A retired surveyor seated near the back slowly walked to the front of the room, carrying enlarged copies of the original subdivision plats. He pointed to the utility connection exactly where Daniel Foster had explained it to me days earlier. "These plans never transferred ownership," he said calmly. "They only show where the subdivision connected into an existing private system." The room grew remarkably quiet. Then another homeowner asked whether the association had ever informed residents that the original easement request had been denied. Patricia admitted she had never seen that document before. Several neighbors exchanged puzzled looks. Someone else asked whether the board had verified ownership before threatening legal action against me. No immediate answer came. As question followed question, it became increasingly clear that many decisions had been based on assumptions repeated over the years instead of verified public records. I remained silent throughout the meeting because there was nothing left for me to prove. The documents, the engineering review, and the county archives had already answered every important question. Near the end of the evening, one board member quietly suggested that the association should suspend any further claims regarding the transmission line until independent legal counsel reviewed the complete historical record. The motion passed without objection. Walking outside into the cool evening air, I realized something almost ironic. The very emergency call intended to pressure me into surrendering authority had instead triggered the investigation that exposed the truth. If no one had called the deputies that morning, the old assumptions might have continued for years. Instead, one routine maintenance project had forced everyone to separate confidence from documentation, and facts had quietly accomplished what arguments never could. Within 2 weeks, the dispute reached the county civil court after the homeowners association filed a petition seeking formal recognition of its claimed authority over the transmission line crossing my ranch. By then, the argument had become much larger than one morning of scheduled maintenance. The courtroom was not filled with dramatic confrontations or raised voices. Instead, it was filled with maps, engineering drawings, property surveys, maintenance records, and decades of carefully preserved documentation. I carried the same worn leather binder my father had trusted for years, but this time it was accompanied by certified copies from the county archives and the engineering department. Patricia sat with the association's attorney across the aisle, surrounded by neatly stacked binders of meeting minutes, maintenance invoices, and neighborhood policies. Their documents demonstrated that the association had spent years maintaining portions of its own distribution network after water entered the subdivision. My documents demonstrated something entirely different. They established where ownership actually began. As testimony unfolded, the county engineer, Daniel Foster, explained the infrastructure in language everyone could understand. Using enlarged utility maps displayed before the court, he pointed to the private transmission line running across my family's ranch before indicating the exact junction where neighborhood distribution pipes branched away. He explained that maintaining downstream infrastructure did not transfer ownership of the upstream transmission system supplying it. The distinction was technical, but the meaning was remarkably simple. The neighborhood depended on the line. It never owned the line. Next came the historical records supervisor from the county archives. She identified the original subdivision filings, the denied easement application submitted more than 20 years earlier, and the temporary revocable access agreement signed by my grandfather. She confirmed that no subsequent deed, recorded easement, purchase agreement, or court order had ever transferred ownership of the transmission line away from the Carter family. The judge reviewed every certified exhibit carefully, occasionally asking questions about dates, filing numbers, and recorded property boundaries. When my turn came to testify, I described the maintenance schedule that had led to the temporary shutdown. I presented inspection reports documenting corrosion, purchase receipts for replacement materials delivered before the shutdown, photographs of warning signs posted at subdivision entrances, copies of advance notices mailed to residents, and maintenance logs showing the work had been planned weeks in advance. Nothing suggested an attempt to disrupt service. Everything pointed toward responsible stewardship of privately owned infrastructure. During cross-examination, the association acknowledged that it had never received a recorded easement granting permanent control over the transmission line. Instead, it argued that years of operational involvement created an expectation of authority. The judge listened patiently before asking a single question that brought the entire courtroom into complete silence. Can expectation replace recorded ownership when the public land records clearly state otherwise? No immediate answer followed. After reviewing the evidence, the judge delivered a decision grounded entirely in documentation rather than assumption. The court recognized my family's ownership of the transmission line, confirmed the validity of the recorded water rights, acknowledged that the temporary access agreement had expired years earlier, and ruled that performing scheduled maintenance on privately owned infrastructure did not constitute unlawful interference. The court further determined that the association's maintenance responsibilities began only after water entered its own distribution network. As I left the courtroom carrying the same binder that had traveled with me since that morning on the ranch, I realized the outcome had never depended on who sounded more convincing. It had depended on which story the records had been telling all along. A few days after the court issued its decision, I returned to the same valve box where everything had started. The fresh section of replacement pipe had already been buried beneath carefully packed soil, leaving only the clean steel access cover visible above the ground. The morning air carried the familiar scent of damp grass and freshly turned earth, while the first rays of sunlight stretched across the pasture. For a long moment, I simply stood there listening to the quiet. No patrol cars, no arguments, no cameras pointed toward my ranch. Just the steady breeze moving through the oak trees exactly as it had long before anyone questioned who owned the water beneath their feet. I unlocked the valve cover, knelt beside the old steel housing, and rested my hand on the same weathered metal my father had touched countless times before me. Years of use had softened its rough edges, but one detail remained exactly as I remembered from childhood. The faded initials he had stamped into the valve housing were still visible beneath the protective coating. I brushed away a little dust with my fingertips and smiled. Those small marks had survived rain, heat, freezing winters, and decades of steady service. They had also survived something else. Assumptions. Slowly, I turned the valve counterclockwise. The mechanism responded with the same deep metallic sound I had heard on the morning everything changed. A second later, the familiar rush of water returned beneath the ground, flowing steadily through the transmission line before branching into the neighborhood beyond my property. That sound had always meant responsibility to my family. Now it also reminded me that truth has its own quiet rhythm. During the weeks that followed, Willow Creek Estates gradually settled back into ordinary life. The Homeowners Association updated its infrastructure records to reflect the court's ruling and worked with the county to establish clearer maintenance coordination whenever future repairs would temporarily affect neighborhood service. Residents who had once believed the transmission line belonged to the association now understood how the system actually worked. Several neighbors even stopped by the ranch to thank me for continuing to maintain infrastructure that benefited both my family and the surrounding community. Those conversations mattered more to me than winning any legal dispute because they were built on understanding instead of misunderstanding. As for Patricia, she no longer spoke about the transmission line as though it belonged to the association. Whether she changed her opinion or simply accepted the documented facts, I honestly could not say. It was no longer important. What mattered was that public records, engineering reports, and decades of careful stewardship had finally replaced years of assumption. Looking back, I sometimes think about how differently the story might have ended if I had reacted with anger that morning instead of patience. One unnecessary argument could have buried the evidence beneath emotion. Instead, every maintenance log, every survey map, every archive document, and every faded set of initials carved into that old valve became another piece of a truth that had existed long before anyone questioned it. My grandfather used to tell me that land does not speak with words. It speaks through boundaries, records, and the people willing to care for it. My father believed that every valve should be turned with respect because countless families depended on the water flowing through it, whether they realized it or not. Standing there beside that quiet ranch with clean water moving beneath my boots once again, I finally understood both lessons completely. Water follows gravity. Justice follows facts.